Happy to be with all of you this afternoon, morning, wherever it is that you are on your Saturday. And I really appreciate you taking time out of the weekend to do this and have this conversation. So just a little bit of context about this briefing, because I've been doing a lot of these over the past few months. Obviously, the war has been in the news and a topic of quite a bit of concern and, as Grant said, controversy. And I just want to maybe provide one caveat before we get started, and that's that we're not really going to get into the details of the Gaza operation itself, because we would need several hours to unpack everything that's happened over the last 12 weeks of fighting inside the Gaza Strip. But what I really want to do is give some context for what led up to the war. How did we get to this point that a war like this is being fought? One that is incredibly complicated because it is an urban war, and the humanitarian consequences are very severe and extreme in the situation. But there is some lead up to it. I think it's important, and that the context really is what matters, and also I think is most likely to be misunderstood or overlooked in conversations about this conflict. So we're going to jump into that, and hopefully in about 30 to 40 minutes I'll get through this presentation, and then there'll be a little bit of time for questions at the end. And if not all the questions, and as Grant said, of course, you're free to email me. I would love to continue conversations with any of you who have additional questions. But a brief agenda for what we'd like to go over today. So there's a few questions I think are really important to answer in terms of understanding how we got to this point and how this war is being fought, or why this war is being fought. The first is, what is Gaza? And for some of you, this might be pretty basic information, but it's unfortunately to the public, it is not very basic, and we need to kind of lay a foundation. And then the next question is, who is Hamas as well? A very misunderstood organization, actually. And then what happened on October 7th? And then finally, what's next? What's been happening, or what is being looked forward to as a result of this conflict and the way that it's being fought? So we'll answer those questions as quickly as we can and just lay ourselves a foundation to understand why is this war being fought. Now, what exactly is Gaza? Gaza really refers to the Gaza Strip, actually. It is a territory, a piece of territory, which is actually about 140 square miles. And prior to 1948, it didn't actually exist. In 1948/1949, Israel's fighting its war for independence. This is also known as the Arab-Israeli War, or by the Palestinians, it's actually referred to as the Nakba, the catastrophe. And the reason being that during this war, there's somewhere between 600, 700, 800 Palestinians who were displaced as a result of the fighting, in addition to Jewish refugees also. But the Palestinian refugees were displaced and then put into essentially two areas. On this map, you can see the West Bank is an area that's on the right-hand side of Israel, or the western bank of the Jordan River. It was annexed by the Kingdom of Jordan in 1949 and basically made a part of the Kingdom of Jordan. And they had a significant share of the Palestinian refugees living inside the West Bank that they were responsible for. But Egypt also had responsibility for some of them, which they basically contained within an area known as the Gaza Strip. If you look down on the southern portion of Israel, next to the border with Egypt, on the left-hand side of the map on the Mediterranean, there's an area there called Gaza. That is the Gaza Strip, about 140 square miles. Basically, what it is a territory that Egypt did not annex because it didn't want to be permanently responsible for Palestinian refugees. Instead, they basically made it one giant refugee camp for Palestinians that they had control over for the next few decades. Now, for a few decades, they're going to have control of it until 1967, when Israel wins the Six-Day War. It takes some territory from most of its surrounding neighbors, the West Bank from Jordan, the Golan Heights from Syria, the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. And really, from 1967 until 2005, Israel is going to be responsible for the Gaza Strip. It's going to have control over it, complete control over it, as well as responsibility to care for the Palestinians inside the Gaza Strip. In 2005, that's going to change. And what you can see here is a map of what the Gaza Strip looked like in 2005. There's a few different color-coded areas, but what I really want to call your attention to is going to be a few areas that kind of dictate the outcome of what happens next after 2005. And that is the areas in blue. Now, the areas in blue are Israeli settlements. So after 1967, Israel doesn't just get control of the Gaza Strip. They begin to actually move, in some cases, some Jewish settlers into the Gaza Strip and creating communities. The challenge is going to be after the first Intifada, which was the late 80s, early 90s, and then the second Intifada, which was about 2000 to 2005, Intifada being a Palestinian uprising or a revolt of sorts against the Israeli authorities. There's going to be a major security issue for these settlements. So in 2005, after the second Intifada, Israel realizes, okay, we have a couple of problems. One, these uprisings are becoming a major security issue. Two, if you look at the map, most of these Jewish settlements are pretty close to the coastline. They're actually fairly removed from Israel proper. And that creates a major drain on the security apparatus, the national security apparatus of Israel, because they have to maintain security for these settlements, which means maintaining a security presence deep inside the Gaza Strip because they're so far removed from Israel proper. And at some point, that's just not sustainable any longer. So in 2005, Israel is going to forcibly remove all of these or evacuate all of these Jewish settlements from the Gaza Strip. We're going to turn over the Gaza Strip to the Palestinian Authority in the hopes that this will create some sort of new status quo in which the Palestinians will offer Israel some peace in exchange for land in the form of a transfer of the Gaza Strip to the Palestinian Authority. But that's not really how things work out, unfortunately, because a couple things are going to happen in the modern history of Gaza almost immediately after Israel leaves. In 2006, Hamas is going to win the elections. They actually win national elections. They should theoretically have been in control of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in 2006. The secular nationalist party known as Fatah did not want Hamas to have control, so a civil war breaks out essentially, in which Hamas is going to violently take control of the Gaza Strip, but is also going to be exiled almost to the Gaza Strip and kicked out of the West Bank for the most part. So the Palestinian Authority is going to control the West Bank, and Hamas is going to control the Gaza Strip, and you're going to have two separate Palestinian governments from about 2007 forward. What you have here now is a territory that since 2007 has not just been governed by a Palestinian government, but by an international terrorist organization known as Hamas. And it is a very challenging area to govern in many ways because it is very small. You get about 140 square miles and about 2.2 million residents. And not the entirety of the Gaza Strip is urban areas, but as you can see here, those urban areas which do exist are incredibly densely populated. This map on the right gives you a visual of just how densely some of these urban centers are populated. It's a major challenge to govern effectively, but it also is something which is ripe for violence against Israel and against the status quo in general. Now, who is Hamas exactly? This is another really important question, and again, something that I think is often misunderstood. Some background in terms of why I choose to focus on this for a moment. Whenever Hamas does something, and I'm not just talking about October 7, even the many conflicts that have been fought with Israel, there's been at least, depending on how you evaluate the size of them, 4 to 6 conflicts post Hamas taking over in 2007. But every time something like that happens, people are going to fall into usually one of two camps, broadly speaking. And those two camps are one that's going to view Hamas as a legitimate anti-colonial, anti-imperialist resistance organization whose actions are completely justified, or another organization, or another camp rather, that views Hamas as an organization that because they are terrorists, are stereotyped as being inherently irrational and spontaneous in the way that they make decisions and undergo actions, and really a group of people that can't be held responsible necessarily for their actions because they don't even know what they're doing. They just sort of do things without thinking about it. Both of those are really oversimplifications of who the organization is, who Hamas is. And I think it's important to kind of combat the stereotypes a little bit, develop a more nuanced view, because in both cases, those oversimplifications can be allowed or used to allow Hamas off the hook and to escape some responsibility for their actions. So let's take a look at the organization and hopefully develop a little bit more nuance behind what exactly it is. How did it start? This is a really important thing to understand. It did not actually start as a terrorist organization. It was a local chapter of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Palestinian chapter, It was a charitable network, actually. If you're not too familiar with the Muslim Brotherhood, it started in the 1920s in Egypt. But even it itself, although it has evolved in some malignant ways over the years, it has a history of being a charitable network. The same thing that the local Palestinian chapter did. It did things like building schools and clinics, hospitals, mosques, things like this. It really was focused on providing social services, providing charitable means to individuals living in the area, and building a society for Palestinians. It was focused primarily on social reform, the idea that they could help Palestinian society more closely align with or look like their vision for an Islamic society. And there was very little, if any, interest in national politics. It was not a violent organization. It was not an organization interested in creating a Palestinian state because their opinion was that they had to build a Muslim Palestinian society before they could build a Palestinian state. That's going to change, however, unfortunately, fairly quickly in the 1980s, and largely because of images like this. This is a photo of a young youth, a young man during the first Intifada, the 1980s. And really, what you're seeing here is a very apt illustration of what the first Intifada was. It was characterized by youths, teenagers, children even throwing stones at Israeli tanks. It really was not an incredibly violent uprising. It was more a kind of a grassroots movement of protests. They gradually evolved and became more violent over time as people realized that there was something building, a movement that was beginning to emerge. And for Hamas, at the time, its leadership was older. It was still very religious. It was very focused on religious ideas and social reform. It was not very political in nature. But they realized very quickly that the organization was going to get left behind if they didn't evolve into something more political and more violent. Because frankly, the youth movement that was beginning to emerge was going to leave them behind if they didn't adapt. So they did. They adapted. And what happens in 1987 is they leave the Muslim Brotherhood behind, so to speak. They become an independent movement known as the Islamic Resistance Movement. Hamas is the Arabic acronym for this term. And this is when you begin to see, and with the release of their first charter or founding document in 1987, it's going to become, ideologically speaking, a much more terroristic and political organization in nature, something that it was not so much previously before that time. Now, the structure of the organization is also a little bit complicated, but important to understand because one of the things that happened, for example, almost immediately after the attack on October 7 was Hamas leaders who were living in a sort of exile in the Arab Gulf state of Qatar, a city called Doha, gave an interview in which they said, okay, so the leadership in Gaza, they knew what they were doing and they carried out this attack. We didn't know that this was going to happen, essentially. We had no idea that this attack was going to happen or that it was going to happen today. And there was some controversy over that. Is that really possible? Is it, could they possibly have escaped the knowledge that something like this was going to happen, given that technically they are the leaders of the organization? And the answer is yes, but it's a little bit confusing. The structure of the organization is what you really need to understand in order to understand what they're saying and what's really going on beneath the surface. Because it is a multiple winged organization, and each of these wings are somewhat siloed from each other. This is not unusual, by the way, for terrorist organizations. But what you have is an organization called Hamas today, which has a political wing, it has a communications wing, it still has a social services wing, and it has a terror wing known as the Al Qassam Brigades. And it is also an organization in which the leadership is split up for various reasons. Some of the leadership lives in the Gaza Strip, some of them live in the West Bank, some in Lebanon, some in Qatar, places like that. But it is actually very true that for operational reasons, many times violent operations or terror operations are siloed from other parts of the organization or leaders living in different locations for security purposes. However, what you need to know is that it has what's known as a fractured consensus model, meaning that despite these divisions and the fact that information is sometimes siloed from other parts of the organization, there is still this sense of consensus that they make decisions as a whole and for the whole. And this is illustrative of what happened in the interview shortly after the leaders made the statement saying, we didn't know October 7th was going to happen. They followed that by saying, however, we support and approve and bless everything that happened on October 7th. Why is that? Because they said that the organization, despite the fact they can't always communicate with each other, everyone in the organization knows what the values of the organization are. And the top line leadership of the organization, the political leadership, are going to give other wings of the organization, like the terror wing, a certain amount of parameters. And as long as they color within the lines or they operate within those parameters, everyone knows that they're going to have the blessing of the organization. And in this case, what the leaders said is that the terror wing, despite not telling the political leaders when the attack was going to happen, they knew they would have the support of the political leadership because they were coloring within the lines. They were operating within the parameters and the values of the organization known as Hamas. Now, what exactly are those values or beliefs, though? What are their goals or parameters that the terror wing needs to operate within? There's a couple of things that are really important to note here. One is that Palestine, and by that I mean everything that is both of Palestinian territories as well as Israel today, they refer to it as one unit known as Palestine or one territory, is for them a Muslim land or a waqf being a religious trust. Meaning that because of this picture you see here, Dome of the Rock, this is part of the Al-Aqsa compound, which encompasses the Al-Aqsa Mosque, Dome of the Rock, or basically the entire compound that the Jewish people would know as the Temple Mount. It's a third holy site in Islam. So the land in which it sits, not just the compound, but really the entire territory known as Palestine, is referred to as a religious trust, therefore, something that they are devoted to, something that they're obligated to protect and manage and maintain. To give it away to anyone, especially to someone of a different faith, like a Jew or a Christian or anyone really of a different faith, would be a sin. They don't have the option of doing that. They have to maintain control of it because it is their religious duty or obligation. The second thing that the organization believes is that Palestinian nationalism is an odd blend of religion and resistance. And again, this kind of goes back to some of the political realism that I was describing in the 1980s, this moment of confronting the reality that while they prefer to be focused on religious ideas, they really couldn't escape the fact that resistance was becoming a part of what it means to be a Palestinian. It was becoming part of the national identity. So for them, they sort of merged the two in order to create something that they could claim for themselves to protect and to represent. And that is this idea that their particular version or brand of Islamism has merged with the idea of resistance against Israel to create a cohesive Palestinian national identity that they're trying to protect. Now, the goals of the organization are to reconcile their responsibility to govern effectively in the Gaza Strip with resistance, which at times can be very contradictory ideas. It's hard to do both at the same time, but they try to. They want to rule a Muslim Palestinian state as well. They don't just want to create one, but to actually govern it themselves and to be in charge of that future state. And in order to do so, in order to create that state in the first place, they must erase Israel or the idea of Zionism or the idea of the Jews having a historical right to self-determination, political self-determination in their historical homeland, known as Israel or Palestine, depending on who you ask. Those things must cease to exist. Those ideologies must be rejected completely, and the Jewish people should no longer exist in the land of Israel. And at times, this is debated a little bit because in 1987, obviously, the first charter came out. In 2017, they put out a new charter, which was designed to combat the international narrative that had led to them being labeled as a terrorist organization, that Hamas was perhaps too anti-Semitic or things of that nature. And so they tried to kind of soften some of the language and argue that, no, we're not really, anti-Semitic. We don't really hate Jews, that sort of thing. But unfortunately, if you read enough of even the new charter that was released in 2017, you'll still find very nihilistic language, very absolutist language. By that, I mean there's really no room or margin for anything but the complete land belonging to Muslim Palestinians and the complete erasure of any Jewish presence or claim to the land. And there's really no softening of language. Even if you look for it, it hasn't actually in reality softened, and it's still a very, frankly, a genocidal charter that they've written for themselves and released in 2017. So what exactly happened on October 7th then? What's going on that led to this major conflict that's being fought for the last 12 weeks? And as Grant pointed out before we started, this is actually a very noteworthy weekend to be having this conversation. Today's 99 days since the conflict started. Tomorrow, Sunday, marks the 100-day mark since October 7th, which is significant not just because of what happened, but because of those who are still suffering the consequences, which we'll get to in a moment. But on October 7th, Hamas terrorists, about somewhere between 2 and 3,000 of them, infiltrated Israel by surprise. I say by surprise because the border between the Gaza Strip and Israel is regarded, or I should say, was regarded as being one of the strongest in the world, impenetrable, very, very difficult to infiltrate. Incredibly advanced technology and control systems, surveillance. It was really, really difficult, unbelievable that anyone could make it past this border. But they did. They overwhelmed the surveillance, they overwhelmed the system itself, and the walls or the fence itself in different parts. And they managed to infiltrate the Israeli southern communities known as the Gaza Periphery or Gaza Envelope that are on the Israeli side of the border between the Gaza Strip and Israel. After doing so, they did a couple of things. It is true that they did attack an IDF military base, although I think it's important to highlight that they did so not because that was their primary target, but because it was a means to an end. What happened essentially is you go into the military base, you look for soldiers, you shoot a bunch of them, you kidnap about 250, and then you shut off all the communications equipment. The primary reason why you would attack the military base is to shut off the communications equipment and essentially shut down Israel's ability to respond to a terrorist infiltration for several hours, which then gave them the freedom that they needed to do what they really came for, and that was to look for civilians. The next thing that they did is they attacked both a music festival in the southern communities, and they attacked about 20 different civilian communities, agricultural communities known as kibbutzim or mashav, and they searched door to door looking for families, men, women, and children to then attack. And if you read much of what's come out, the evidence about what instructions they were given, or if you've seen the videos or heard the recordings of them describing what they were doing, why they were there, then it's very clear that that was the real purpose was to attack these civilian communities and inflict as much terror as possible on the Israeli population. Now, the things that they did really fall into three categories: torture, murder, and kidnapping. And we'll unpack each of these a little bit. And this is going to be not very graphic because there's significantly worse material available online. The photos are not too extreme, although if you feel nervous about it, you might want to look away for a little bit. But it's really just photos of faces, not of the actual damage or destruction for the most part. That being said, this is difficult to hear, but I think important for individuals to understand exactly what happened. Again, because this context is really, really important in understanding why a war is being fought in the first place. So before killing anyone, they made very intentional efforts to torture as many people as possible. And the question I think has to be asked, why would you do that? It's going to slow you down. It's not the most efficient use of your time if you're just trying to kill as many Jews as possible. Why would you take the time to stop and torture them in methodical ways? And the answer, I think, is that two things. One, it is probably the best way to inflict as much psychological terror on people as possible. It's a form of psychological warfare, very effective for a terror organization. But the second thing is it's not just designed to create fear, but also designed to send a message both to other Palestinians who are watching what's happening, or to Israelis or to the world at large, that Jews are less than human. The reason that you can get away with torturing someone in these ways is because they are less than human. They don't deserve to exist. They are animalistic in nature and can deservedly be treated as such. So what's going to happen then is they're going to use torture to censor these messages. And some of the methodology that would be used would be things like cutting limbs off, cutting off fingers or toes. They would tie children together in front of their parents or tie individuals together as well, or simply their hands behind their back. They would torture a parent in front of a child or vice versa. They would torture someone, force them to watch something, and then gouge out their eyes. There were beatings. There were examples of burning, both burning someone alive to death or simply burning them for the purpose of torture. And something that has remarkably gone, mm, I shouldn't say unnoticed, but not acknowledged as much as it should be for almost 2.5 months after October 7, is the sexual violence. The sexual violence that occurred on October 7 was at at a simply staggering scale. The evidence that's piling up now is fairly obvious, and that it was grotesque and widespread. But for various reasons, the international community took a very long time to acknowledge that it actually happened. And it's taken many eyewitnesses, many victims coming forward, and a massive campaign of information and release of evidence that ordinarily would be kept private to preserve the victim's dignity in order to convince the international community that these things actually occurred. But really, what you need to know is that it did. And again, it was grotesque and at a staggeringly large scale. All of these things, again, have a purpose. It's designed to instill fear. It's designed to send a message that the Jews who are living in these periphery communities around the border of the Gaza Strip, they don't deserve to be there because they are, in fact, less than human. Now, once they're done torturing individuals, obviously a fairly methodical murder campaign is also going to ensue. And here I think it's important to understand a little bit of the methodology again, because it explains a little bit of the controversy that's followed October 7. So, for example, shooting and stabbing, absolutely that makes some sense. That those are very common methods of killing someone. But part of what happened after October 7 was also widespread mutilation, or cases where they would, cut bodies apart, or you would hold a rifle to someone's head and then shoot 10 to 15 times. Why would you do that? Well, because what's essentially done is the face is so incredibly disfigured afterwards, obviously, that it's beyond recognition. And this explains a little bit of the controversy, I think, that followed October 7, where the numbers of bodies shifted. And every few weeks you'd get an updated number. Okay, higher number, maybe now it's a lower number, and it led to some credibility issues for Israel, where Hamas, anytime Israel changed the number of individuals who were killed on October 7, Hamas would say, "Okay, you're exaggerating. It wasn't actually that many people that died. You can't get your numbers straight. How do you expect anyone to believe you?" And the reality, I think, is pretty sinister, actually. This is, I think, an intentional move on the part of Hamas, because if you think about it and you sit down with the people who are responsible to collect the bodies, to identify them, to prepare them for burial, they'll give you a pretty simple answer about why it's so hard to get the numbers straight. And that's because they have bodies that are in multiple body bags. They have bodies that are in so many pieces that they have trouble putting them back together and figuring out how many bodies do we have because they're in so many pieces. They actually had to, this is, I think, a very revealing illustration of just how complicated the process became and still is today. They're still trying to identify the victims in many cases. They had to bring in the Israeli Antiquities Authority to help identify the bodies of the victims. And that might sound a little bit absurd. What do the archaeologists have to do with this? How are they going to help identify the bodies? And again, it's really pretty simple when you listen to the explanation and think about it. The reason why the archaeology authorities were brought in to help identify the remains of victims is because, frankly, they're the world's leading experts on finding human teeth. And in many cases, the only way to identify victims was either through dental records or through extremely small fragments of bone that they were then able to extract a little bit of DNA from in order to identify the victims. Again, that's why it's so challenging, and the struggle that Israel's still facing is telling the world the truth about what happened, but in a compelling and credible way, because they're still trying to put the pieces, literally put the pieces back together. Now, there's other methods used as well, which are very frequently used to sort of compare Hamas to ISIS. I do think it's important to note that Hamas is not literally ISIS, because that hashtag was going around for a while and it really was pretty misleading. They're not. They believe very different things, actually. They are enemies of sorts. But some of the tactics used should probably remind listeners and viewers of ISIS, things like beheading. This was also challenged by Hamas, who basically argued never happened. They would deny it, but it's pretty hard to deny it when they filmed themselves doing this. Okay, it's available online. The photos, the videos of them taking a hoe or garden tools to someone and then beheading them with those tools, burning individuals alive, happened very frequently, and in all ages. This is something I think is also really important to understand, that they didn't just choose victims of, military fighting age, things of that nature, which would maybe allow them to justify some of their actions to the international community. They attacked people of all ages. Grandparents, Holocaust survivors were killed by Hamas terrorists, which is just shocking to think about. They killed babies, and it is often denied, but again, I can tell you a significant part of the work that I've been doing for the last few months is sifting through some of the evidence, the photos, the videos, and I've seen it. It's true. They literally burned babies alive, which is so beyond the pale, beyond comprehension. We don't even have a category for that in many cases, how to process that kind of information. But that's what they were doing. And again, if you think back to what I said a few minutes ago about how they justify their actions, what the organization believes, it makes sense. If the Jews don't have a right to exist in the land of Israel, and if their goals are to completely erase the Jewish presence from the land of Israel to preserve the legitimacy and the faithfulness of the purity of an Islamic society in the land of Palestine, then the mere existence of a Jewish baby, the existence of a Jewish baby is an act of violence in their eyes, one that has to be punished. That's what they do. That's how they justify themselves, and that's what they're literally going to do on October 7 is seek to erase the Jewish presence from these communities in the border with Gaza, including the children and the Jewish babies. Now, the kidnapping that also follows is pretty straightforward. I think it's most likely designed to create leverage. If you look at many of the negotiations that happened once the war started, in exchange for getting hostages back, Hamas wants a certain number of Palestinian prisoners back, most of which have been accused of or convicted of violence or terrorism. But in order to create this leverage, they're going to kidnap about 240 people, men, women, and children, mostly civilians in these cases. Again, they're of all ages. You can see here in this photo, actually, one of the women who was eventually released in exchange for three Palestinian prisoners who had all been accused of violence. She was a grandmother. This is an old elderly woman who is being taken hostage into the Gaza Strip, and up to 30 nationalities represented. That's really
Mm.
important to note. This wasn't just an attack on Israelis, but up to 30 nationalities were represented among the kidnapping victims. Now, to sum all of this up, what this means essentially in terms of the numbers is that Hamas terrorists killed 1,139 Israeli citizens. They kidnapped 240 plus individuals and it displaced thousands of people, about 100,000 from the southern communities, and another 100,000 or so have been displaced from northern Israel as a result of the overflow of the fighting into southern Lebanon. To put it into even more context, those numbers mean that October 7th was the single bloodiest day in Israeli history. It was the bloodiest day in Jewish history since the Holocaust, and it was the equivalent of 15 9/11 events. In a country the size of New Jersey, essentially, simply shocking the scale of the impact that this has on Israeli society, and that every single Israeli citizen knows at least one person who was killed, kidnapped, or is currently fighting in the Gaza Strip. What's next then is really the next question. Okay, so there's obviously something that absolutely horrendous has happened. But what is going to be the response from Israel, or what are they prioritizing as they think about a response to these attacks? Obviously, there's a war being fought, but I think it's important to know a little bit about what their short term and their long term priorities are and how they're playing out. In the short term, there's a couple of things that they have to keep in mind. One being the hostages. This is obviously a very, very serious concern for a state. The legitimacy of the state of Israel is predicated in part upon their ability to protect their citizens. If they can't do so, and if they cannot return these hostages home, the government might collapse, and there's some very serious questions for Israel as a state and as a society about the safety of the Jewish people who live in the Jewish state of Israel. The second concern that they have as well is going to be anti-Semitism. This is something that is pretty remarkable in terms of its scope and how widespread it has become. But I think it is important to acknowledge that this is also a very serious issue for Israel right now. The fact that, for example, in the United States, just in the United States, since October 7, anti-Semitism has increased some 400%, according to organizations like the Anti-Defamation League. That is a staggering, rapid increase in the amount of anti-Semitism. And unfortunately, for our purposes, we're talking about college campuses or university campuses. These have become places where this is incredibly common and widespread, unfortunately, enough so that Jewish students feel unsafe. There are stories of Jewish students having to hide in the library behind locked doors with campus security because outside there's a mob who is clamoring to get in and do who knows what with these Jewish students. It's a very real threat, not just in terms of the language being used, but potentially a very physical threat to the safety of Jewish students in the United States. And because this is what's going on, because of the nature of what happened on October 7th being so blatantly anti-Semitic, so anti-Jewish, anti, the Jewish people's right to exist in the land of Israel at all, and the way that it's spreading to the Jewish people around the world, it's a very serious issue for Israel that they have to confront. It's also showing up in especially unique ways in international institutions, even. For example, in some cases, broad denial that October 7 happened or that specific atrocities happened on October 7, despite the fact that there is abundant physical forensic evidence for all of these things. Or the argument that it's simply a conspiracy or that Israel doesn't have a right to defend itself. If Israel doesn't have a right to defend itself, what that would seem to imply then is that Hamas was right, that they had a right to attack Israel without any consequences, and that Israel, by extension, doesn't have a right to exist at all. And this is where you really begin to find that fine line between criticism of Israel and specific policies or specific institutions or specific individuals that are a part of Israeli society and criticism of Israel's right to exist at all. When you cross that line, when you delegitimize Israel's right to exist at all, or the Jewish people's right to exist in the land of Israel at all, then it's crossed the line from legitimate criticism to blatant anti-Semitism or Jew hatred. The last thing that they're also going to be concerned about, in the immediate term, is not just these threats to the hostages and to the Jewish people, but also the broader region as well. Regional stability is very important, obviously, to Israel as well, not just for their own safety, but also for the sake of maintaining international support for what they're trying to do in terms of protecting themselves. They can't very well ask countries like the United States to continue supporting them if World War III breaks out, and the United States obviously does not want to see World War III happen. So Israel has to find a way to get the job done, to return the hostages and protect themselves without starting World War III in the region. Unfortunately, this is complicated by the fact that there are various Iranian proxies like Hezbollah in Lebanon or the Houthis in Yemen are actively trying to destabilize the situation by not necessarily getting involved in the war full scale or declaring war on Israel, but by carrying out a wide variety of distracting operations, destabilizing operations like shooting at ships, as the Houthis are, or shooting into Israel as Hezbollah has, in an attempt to distract or provoke some sort of response from Israel. So these are obviously some very complicated and precarious things that Israel has to manage right now in the short term. But looking ahead, I think there's a couple of things to keep in mind. One, there have been some results, and it's good to celebrate this, but also to be mindful of what work still needs to be done. More than 100 hostages have been freed and returned to Israel. Many of them are reporting, however, that they suffered extremely in the Gaza Strip from a lack of medication, food, water, other forms of medical care, or that they were psychologically tortured or sexually abused, even. These are things which are going to require a significant amount of time for the hostages to recover from, both physically, but also emotionally, mentally, spiritually. Obviously, there's some real damage and hurt that has to be addressed here in terms of restoring the hostages and going through the healing process. There's also 100 plus hostages, about 136 right now at the time of this recording, that are still inside the Gaza Strip, and Israel still is trying to celebrate, but also mindful of the fact that they still have family members that need to be rescued from the Gaza Strip. In terms of long-term priorities or questions, I think there's a couple of things that Israel really has to think about right now. The first one being who's going to replace Hamas. Israel's declared that they want to replace Hamas. They want to destroy it enough that it has to leave the Gaza Strip, or that there has to be a replacement. There can be a replacement for Hamas, and someone else can be put in charge there in the Gaza Strip. The question, though, is who is that going to be? The nature of counterinsurgency and the history of counterinsurgency teaches us that that's a very difficult question. You can destroy an organization, but destroying an idea of what the organization stands for, represents, is much more difficult. And finding someone who's willing to accept that task is likely to be challenging, something that Israel is really going to have to wrestle with over the next few years, probably. And the second long-term question is, what about the peace process? What about that two-state solution that we've been chasing for 20, 30 years now? And the reality is very difficult, but I think we need to confront the reality as it is, that it's going to be very hard in order for negotiations or peace processes to resume anytime soon. It's going to be very, very challenging for the two sides to reach a two-state solution, because both the Israelis and Palestinians are incredibly traumatized by what Hamas has done and what Israel is doing in order to, rescue their hostages and correct the wrong that's been done. There's a very high cost on both sides of this conflict, enough so that it is very difficult to imagine the peace process restarting anytime in the very near future. Now, what I'd like to do is close with a couple of thoughts on how to be praying for the situation, because it is, seemingly in some ways an impossible situation. There are glimmers of hope, obviously, but when you're dealing with evil that is both this scale and this type, it is very easy to despair and just throw up your hands and go, God, what is happening? Why? And not know how to process that information. But I think the most important thing we can do is to be pressing in to that relationship with the Lord and praying for his wisdom and guidance and comfort during these times. Not only for those who are affected, but also for everyone else who's just trying to process what happened. So there's a couple things I would definitely be praying for. One would be his presence and his comfort, that he would be near and that he would provide comfort and hope during this very difficult time. And the second thing would be his justice and his protection. There are so many innocent people who were brutally slaughtered or kidnapped or abused in so many ways because of what's happening. And there were terrible injustices done, which need to be addressed. And ultimately, we serve a God who is just, and it is important that we are really looking to Him for a sense of justice and protection from the evil that we see around us, and it is so present in the world today. Finally, for release, healing, and restoration, this is especially true of the hostages, and I say this because at the time that I'm recording this, it is 99 days. Tomorrow will be 100 days since the hostages were taken into the Gaza Strip, and at this point, it's unclear how many of them are still alive. The families are just desperate to receive any news of their loved ones, hoping against hope that somehow they're still alive and they might someday come back to them. And there's some really, really sad stories from the families of these hostages, but I think it's important to be praying for them, for their families, that they would have hope and endurance during this difficult time. The hostages would be released. But as I already mentioned, even those that have been released are facing such incredible challenges. It's important to be praying for their healing and their restoration as well. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate everyone's time, and I hope this information is helpful. It is encouraging. It's not, I'm sure, easy to hear or to think about, but I hope that it is somewhat encouraging and that it has given you, something to think about and some tools for understanding the situation. Again, thank you so much for your time.